Alright, we're going to start talking about localized functions of the cerebral cortex. So there are different areas of the cerebral cortex that are specialized to perform certain functions. And each area plays its role in the response to a stimulus. So I'm kind of a big picture person, so I like to look at the big picture and then we'll narrow it down to the specifics. So the big picture, and we'll talk about these 5 specific areas. The 5 areas we're going to talk about are the primary sensory cortex, primary motor cortex, secondary sensory cortex, motor planning areas, and the association cortex. So the primary sensory cortex, it performs simple sensory discrimination. It discriminates intensity and quality of a sensation. And then it passes that information to the secondary sensory cortex. The secondary sensory cortex recognizes that sensation and then passes it on to the association cortex, which performs interpretation. It processes it with regard to emotions and memory, and goal selection, planning, and monitoring. So the association cortex does a lot. And then, if action is required, it passes that information on to the motor planning areas where movement, composition, and sequencing is performed, and then on to the primary motor cortex for the cortical motor output. That's where the upper motor neurons are, and they send that information out to the body. So that's the whole picture. Now we're going to break it down into the individual areas and what they do, and then disorders of those individual areas and what happens. So, the 5 categories that I just went through: primary sensory cortex discriminates among different intensities and quality of sensory information. Primary motor cortex provides descending control of motor output. Secondary sensory cortex performs more complex analysis of sensation, so it actually recognizes it. Motor planning organizes movements, and the association cortex controls behavior, interprets sensation, and processes emotions and memories with regard to that sensation. So I would like you to know those. I would like you to know those 5 categories and what they do. Okay? So the primary sensory areas, it includes areas for somatosensory, auditory, visual, and vestibular information. Okay, so the primary somatosensory cortex receives information from tactile and proprioceptive receptors via the 3-neuron pathway, the dorsal column medial lemniscus. Remember we talked about this? Chapter 6. It's all coming back to you. Okay. So that's your basic, that's where the information goes in the cortex when we get that sensory information in. Okay. So the primary somatosensory system, it discriminates the shape, texture, and size of objects. It says that's round, it's smooth, and it's small. If we're talking about a ping pong ball, maybe. The primary auditory cortex, it's conscious discrimination of loudness and pitch of sounds. It says I hear a sound, it's loud, and it's low. Something like that. The primary visual cortex distinguishes intensity of light, shape, size, and location of objects. Okay, dark light, where is it? Primary vestibular discriminates among head positions and head movements, just like we talked about in chapter 16. So easy stuff, right? So the primary auditory cortex, we talked about the somatosensory cortex, receives information from the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. Primary auditory cortex receives information from the cochlea of both ears, providing conscious awareness of the intensity of sounds, and it comes through the thalamus because it's conscious awareness. Primary vestibular cortex receives information regarding head movement and head position relative to gravity. Same thing, conscious awareness through the thalamus. Primary visual cortex, individual neurons in the cortex are specialized to distinguish between light and dark, various shapes, locations of objects, and movement of objects. So they're individual neurons just to detect those individual things, which is kind of cool. So if you have a disorder, a lesion, or any kind of disorder in that primary sensory cortex, you lose the ability to discriminate among different intensities and qualities of sensory information. So it interferes with the capacity to use the incoming sensations. Okay, makes sense, right? So I love these charts in the book. So the first chart is from chapter 17, this one, and the disorder chart is from chapter 18. I put them together because I like them together. It makes sense to me. So when the primary somatosensory cortical area is affected, you lose tactile localization and conscious proprioception. So like back summer in 105 when we did the proprioception testing, conscious proprioception, the person was blindfolded or had their vision blocked, and you said, is your finger up or down? If they lose their primary somatosensory area, even if they have the sensory neurons functioning properly, they cannot tell, or they can't localize where the sensation is. A lesion in the primary auditory cortex causes loss of localization of sounds. They can't tell where the sounds are coming from. A lesion in the primary visual cortex causes homonymous hemianopsia. That it's the lesion that's posterior to the optic chiasma, like we talked about in the last chapter, in chapter 16. So it's a lesion in the primary visual cortex. You lose half the visual field out of each eye. If you have a lesion in the primary vestibular cortex, you cannot detect or you have an altered awareness of head position and movement. Okay? So the secondary sensory areas, they integrate tactile and proprioceptive information that are obtained from manipulating an object. That's the somatosensory area. The secondary visual, so there's a secondary area that goes with each of the primary areas. The secondary visual cortex analyzes colors, emotions, and directs visual fixation. So what are we focusing our eyes on? The secondary auditory cortex compares sounds with memories of other sounds and categorizes the sounds, language, music, noise, whatever it is. So in the primary auditory cortex, sensory information comes in from the cochlear nerve, and the vestibular cochlear nerve, and it says, hey, I hear a sound, and it's loud and it's low. It passes it to the secondary auditory cortex, and the auditory cortex says, okay, it's not language, it's not music, that's a noise, I know what that is. And it passes it on to the association area, which is then going to figure out what kind of noise it is. Okay? So if you have a lesion, so the secondary somatosensory, it controls stereognosis and the memory of tactile and spatial environment. So I don't know if you remember back in chapter 6 when I was talking about stereognosis, and I talked about the lab from Jamie's class where one of my classmates had a key and I had to identify it without using vision, and I picked it up and I'm like, oh, that's a Toyota key, because I had that memory of that information. So secondary visual, it analyzes motion, color, and visual fixation, and secondary auditory classifies the sounds. So since disorders of the sensory association areas are called agnosia, and agnosia means, basically if you break the word down, it means inability to know. Interesting, right? So agnosia is the inability to recognize objects. You don't know what that is. Despite the fact that you have intact sensory receptors, this damage to the secondary, the sensory association areas, you can't identify it. You can't recognize objects. So astereognosis is the inability to identify objects by touch and manipulation despite intact discriminative somatosensation. Okay, visual agnosia is the inability to visually recognize objects despite intact vision. And auditory agnosia is the inability to recognize sounds despite intact hearing. Okay? So, the the primary motor cortex is located in the precentral gyrus. It's anterior to the central sulcus, and it's the source of most of the neurons in the cortical spinal tract. Those are those upper motor neurons. It controls contralateral voluntary movements, particularly the fine movements of the hand and face. There's a much greater proportion of the total area of the primary motor cortex devoted to neurons in the hands and face than in any other part of the body. There's a lot of area in the primary motor cortex devoted to fine motor skills, and the gross motor activity has less area. Makes sense, right? So disorders of the primary motor cortex, one of them is called apraxia. And apraxia, it's sort of the movement version of agnosia. So it's the inability to perform a movement or sequence of movements despite intact sensation and an understanding of the task. It occurs as a result of damage to the premotor or supplementary motor areas. So an example would be if you hand someone a toothbrush and toothpaste, you said, okay, now brush your teeth. They might take the toothbrush, brush their teeth, and then put the toothpaste on it. So they can't sequence things properly. Even though they understand it, they know what's supposed to go on, but those areas in their motor cortex aren't working. They can't organize the activity. Despite the fact that they understand it and they have the coordination and sensation to do it, they can't put it all together. Motor perseveration is the uncontrollable repetition of a movement. For example, if someone were to, you told someone, hey, lock those brakes on that wheelchair, they would lock and unlock, lock and unlock, lock and unlock, and that's motor perseveration. They're just repeating that movement, they can't control it. Probably if you told them to stop, they would, but they're not going to have the motivation internally to do it. Broca's aphasia is a damage to the premotor cortex, and it's difficulty expressing ideas using language or symbols, and you get an impairment in both speaking and writing. So Broca's aphasia is in the left hemisphere. Broca's area is in the left hemisphere. If you get if you get damage to the analogous area in the right hemisphere, people have difficulty coming up with the motor planning to do emotional gestures. They tend to have a very flat affect, and they can't express emotion non-verbally. Okay, so then the motor planning areas are the cortex anterior to the primary motor cortex. One of them is the supplementary motor area. It's important for the initiation of movement, orientation of the eyes and heads, and planning bimanual or two-handed tasks and sequential movements. The premotor area controls trunk and girdle muscles via the medial upper motor neurons, so it does those anticipatory postural adjustments from sensory information. Broca's area is responsible for planning movements of the mouth during speech and the grammatical aspects of language. The analogous area in the right hemisphere is responsible for nonverbal communication, including emotional gestures and adjusting the tone of voice. So if those areas are damaged, they have trouble varying their tone of voice and doing the nonverbal emotional gestures. So basically, the motor areas, the primary motor cortex takes care of voluntarily controlled movements. The premotor area is control of trunk and girdle movements and anticipatory postural adjustments. The supplementary motor area is in control of initiation of movement, orientation planning, bimanual and sequential movements. Broca's area is motor programming of speech, and that's just in the left hemisphere. On the opposite side, on the right hemisphere, the area that's analogous to Broca's is responsible for planning nonverbal communication, emotional gestures, tone of voice, and that's the right hemisphere. Okay, so the primary motor cortex, if you have damage there, you result in dysarthria. And dysarthria is a speech disorder that results from either spasticity or paresis of the muscles used for speaking. So that's different from Broca's aphasia. The muscles still work, but you can't plan the movements properly to use them. With dysarthria, it's actually a problem with either spasticity or flaccicity of the muscles. And just like we talked about in the motor chapter, spastic dysarthria is caused by damage to the upper motor neurons. It's characterized by harsh, awkward speech. So spasticity in the muscles of the limbs, it's harsh, awkward movements, if you think of it that way, or sort of jerky, awkward movements. Flaccidity is caused by damage to the lower motor neurons, and it's characterized by paresis of speech muscles. Just like flaccidity in the limbs, it's caused by damage to the lower motor neurons. So that should make sense, I hope. So when you have damage to the primary motor cortex, you get that either flaccid or spastic dysarthria. Damage to the premotor area and or the supplementary motor area, you get apraxia, and that's trouble. You have all the tools, but you can't pull together the task. You can't plan a motor task or a sequential task. And Broca's area in the left hemisphere, you have difficulty producing speech. So Broca's aphasia is what's that's called, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. In the analogous area in the right hemisphere, you have difficulty producing nonverbal communication. Okay? So the association areas of the cerebral cortex, there are several different areas which we'll talk about. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, its functions include self-awareness and executive functions. So executive functions, they include deciding on a goal, planning on how to accomplish the goal, executing that plan, and then monitoring the execution of the plan. So that is something that most adults do on a day-to-day basis. So this is just our normal life. We decide on a goal, we plan how to do it, we do it, and we assess how we did. Okay? So when people have lesions in the dorsal prefrontal cortex, it doesn't really have any effect on their intelligence. They're actually able to perform like paper and pencil problem solving tasks like math problems and crossword puzzles and that sort of thing, as well as they were before the damage. But they tend to function poorly in daily life because they lack goal orientation and they lack behavioral flexibility. So that is just in that dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So in the pictures in the book on, page 417 is one of them. It shows where these areas are in the brain, and you don't need to know that specifically, but it is just interesting to see where it's looked. The parieto-temporal, strangely enough, in the parietal and temporal lobes, parieto-temporal association cortex, that's where cognitive intelligence is. Functions primarily in cognitive intelligence. So problem solving and comprehension of communication and spatial relationships happen there. So the spatial coordination system of the parieto-temporal association cortex is essential for constructing an image of one's own body and planning movements. So damage to these areas interferes with it also interferes with emotional responses. So it interferes with emotional response to inferred emotional events. And so if you have damage to these areas, it can cause problems with social interactions with people, and people can even develop some paranoia and delusions based on this because they're interpreting emotional events differently. So people with parietal temporal association cortex lesions tend to have intact intellectual abilities, but they use poor judgment, they're impulsive, and they have difficulty conforming to social conventions. So working with brain injured people, a lot of times I feel like is one of the most difficult groups of people to work with in therapy, because they don't respond to you the way you would expect them to. So the poor judgment and impulsive and difficulty conforming to social conventions. There's one really nice woman that I've worked with several times in the past, and actually her brain injury was many years ago, and I have mostly worked with her on orthopedic issues, but she has the intact intellectual ability. She's actually quite intelligent, and knows a lot about anatomy and physiology, but she uses poor judgment. She's impulsive, and she has difficulty conforming to social conventions. So it's difficult for her to recover from an orthopedic injury because of that poor judgment and impulsivity. She'll try to do something like put her leg way up on the parallel bars to stretch it when she just had a hip fracture 6 weeks ago. It's probably not the best idea, but that impulse control is missing, and so she'll do it anyway. And it's so someone, they can have normal intellectual abilities, but then they have those judgment and behavior issues. So in the ventral and medial dorsal prefrontal association cortex, those are also involved in impulse control, personality, and reactions to surroundings. So a lot of times people with brain injuries, unless they have like an incredibly supportive family and friend group, a lot of times they have a hard time maintaining their existing relationships after their brain injury because their personalities change so much and their reactions to surroundings. So the ventral prefrontal association area connects with areas that regulate mood and affect, which is your observable demeanor. And the medial dorsal prefrontal cortex, it controls how you perceive other people's emotions, and it makes assumptions about what other people believe and what their intentions are. So if you have a problem there, that can really cause problems with interpersonal relationships, and it can develop into paranoia and delusions and that sort of thing. So lesions in this area, they can cause poor judgment, defective social intelligence is what they call it, where you just can't interact with other people in a normal way. People have trouble maintaining employment because of that, and their interpersonal relationships, and their social status. So that it can be a really challenging area to have a lesion in. So, again, I love these charts about the effects of the different lesions, which is pretty neat. A lot of times as a result of a brain injury or some other different types of neurological disorders, you can get emotional lability, which is the abnormal, uncontrolled expression of emotions. So there are 3 aspects of emotional lability. One is abrupt mood shifts. Usually they anger quickly or get depressed or anxious. You can have people who appear to shift from mood to mood with no stimulus. The second aspect is involuntary, inappropriate emotional expression in the absence of subjective emotion. So that's the pathological laughter or crying. People are crying and they don't know why. So, or laughing. Or emotion triggered by non-specific stimuli that's unrelated to the emotional expression. So somebody who starts crying when they see that it's raining outside, well, I don't know, I guess I could do that on some days, but anyway, it's triggered by just some stimulus that wouldn't ordinarily trigger an emotion. So there's a table from chapter 18 which talks about the prevalence of emotional lability in neurologic conditions. And you can see that a lot of the conditions we've talked about, ALS, Alzheimer's, MS, Parkinson's, stroke, and traumatic brain injury, we'll talk a little bit about more. There's a high percentage of people with those conditions that have emotional lability. So it's something that we have to deal with a little bit. And they're now starting to call it pseudobulbar effect, and they're considering it an undertreated neurological disorder. And I think one or two of the pharmaceutical companies have come out with a medication to treat this, and I don't know how effective it is because I've never actually discussed it with anybody who has been treated by that. So I've seen commercials on TV for it though, but it's kind of an interesting thing that pseudobulbar effect is what they're now calling it as of 2011. So so really, you know, it always comes back to the question, what do I need to know for the test? Well, here it is, all in one nifty little chart. So the individual areas, what their function is, what the disorder involving them is. So a nice little chart, easy to study from. This is what I expect you to know for the test. Okay? So I'm going to talk just briefly about memory, and the reason I'm going to talk about this is that these questions tend to show up on the board exam. So it's something that's nice to have a little exposure to before you take the board exam. So we'll talk about 3 different types of memory: working memory, declarative memory, and procedural memory. So working memory is the temporary storage and manipulation of information. It maintains goal-relevant information for a short amount of time. So working memory is important, or it's essential for language, problem solving, mental navigation, and reasoning. Complex multitasking requires working memory, and it's central to cognition. So this is we use this every single day. We gotta, you know, go around and do things and remember what just happened. Declarative memory concerns facts, events, concepts, and locations. Refers to recollections that can be easily verbalized. It's also called conscious or explicit memory. That is the type of memory that you demonstrate on a test. Okay, when you're taking a test. It has 3 stages, requires attention during recall. It's not a subconscious thing. The 3 stages are encoding, so processing the information into a memory representation, consolidation, stabilizing the memories, and retrieval, retrieving the memories. So encoding is where you are first exposed to the information, where you're learning it, and you're processing it into your brain, basically. Consolidation stabilizes memories, and so one of the ways you can consolidate, and a lot of the educational research that I was reading last spring and summer was talking about different ways to consolidate information and stabilize memories. One of the ways you can do it is by frequently quizzing yourself on that information. This is why I have a quiz every week, because I'm trying to help you with that consolidation phase. Another way you can consolidate and stabilize memories is to interleave that information with things you already know. So a lot of times I'll say, hey, we talked about this in kinesiology, or hey, we talked about this in tests and measures, or in modalities, and I'm trying to interleave that information with what you already know so you can stabilize that memory, and then when it comes time to retrieve it on the exam, there it is. It's there for you. Okay, so this is a near and dear to our hearts, declarative memory in school. It's a big thing. Procedural memory is the knowledge of how to do actions and skills. So a lot of the things we learn in the PTA program is procedural memory, because we're learning modalities techniques and manual therapy techniques and patient handling techniques, and the gait tasks you're doing with Jamie. This is all related in procedural memory. So it refers to the recall of skills and habits. It's also called skill memory, habit memory, non-conscious memory, or implicit memory. It includes perceptual and cognitive skill learning. Perceptual skills include object, pattern, and face recognition, and practice is required to store procedural memories. So if you want to get better at something, an action and a skill, you have to practice it. That's what's required to store that in long-term memory. Okay, so there's a little chart, because I like charts, of the 3 different types of memory. So nice and spiffy, right? So I'm going to wrap this up, and in the next section we're going to talk about communication and perception and disorders of communication. And it's a really interesting area. There are a lot of cool videos associated with it, and so that will be in the next section.